Imagine you are a Scot in the 19th century. Let's call him Dave. Dave was born in the Scottish Highlands in 1855 into a family that had farmed in Scotland for centuries on the same small piece of land they rented from a landowner. When Dave turns 25, his family are told by the landlord that the rent is going to go up to double what he is currently paying. Secretly, the landowner is saying this because he wants to raise money by getting rid of the family and investing in sheep farming instead. So, Dave and his family are forced to leave, but fortunately, there are better paying opportunities in the lowlands. So, Dave goes off and finds a job in an iron factory as a welder in Glasgow. On the one hand, this is an improvement. Dave has more money for his family than he did in the Highlands. However, in order to get this money, Dave has to work for 10 hours a day doing hard manual labour in dirty, dark and dangerous conditions. He and his family have to live in cramped conditions in a tenement where cholera is commonplace because of dirty water and poor sanitation. Dave's dream his entire life has been to one day own a piece of land and return to the life he enjoyed in the Highlands, of farming and living on his own land. But Dave thinks this dream is impossible. Until one day he comes across a poster. The poster depicts a sunlit prairie with a solid wood-framed house in the background and cows and sheep grazing in the foreground. And on it reads, "Own your own home in Canada and apply for a ready-made farm." The promise almost seems too good to be true. And yet, Dave thinks, what do I have to lose? The price of a journey to North America has gone down in recent years, and he and his family have just enough to afford the passage. Hello, and welcome to the second video on migration and empire from 1830 to 1939. Okay, first things first, please don't mention a bloke called Dave in your exams. Dave is completely fictional, and I made him up just to illustrate the sort of problems that Scots were facing in the 19th century. Dave's story is useful, however, as it reminds us of the pattern of many Scottish lives at this time. In the previous video, we discussed the factors that pushed Scots to leave Scotland. Above all, we noted how the Industrial Revolution, by disrupting the lives of millions of Scots, was the key factor that pushed Scots to leave Scotland. Remember, the key question we're looking at here is why did 2.3 million Scots leave between 1830 to 1939? Whether they had been forcefully evicted from their life in the Highlands, were suffering from the exhaustion and relative lack of pay in a factory in Glasgow or Dundee, or an ambitious doctor or engineer wanting a greater quality of life, Scots were being pushed to consider leaving Scotland altogether. The push factors, the negative elements that encouraged Scots to leave, however, only tells one half of the story. As we have seen, conditions in Scotland were not always that bad compared to other countries. There were improvements taking place as well as problems. This video then will provide a detailed look at the pull factors. So this is the factors in other countries, the good factors that are encouraging those Scots to come to those countries. There are 6 sections to this video. First, we will have a look at the poster that the fictional Dave saw in Glasgow in the late 19th century and ask some questions about the poster. Then, we will answer these questions by highlighting 4 key factors. These 4 factors will give you everything you need to know about the pull factors in Scotland from 1830 to 1939. Finally, we will do a quick recap of the key themes and information. Okay, let's get started. At the start of this video, we introduced Dave, the Highlander displaced from his life in the Highlands to work in an iron factory in Glasgow. His story, while made up, represents an increasingly typical story for Scots. In 1870, 46% of Scots who emigrated to the USA came from jobs in industry. So that could be engineering or mining or factory work. And it was often from places like Glasgow that people would have emigrated from. Remember in the last video that the population of Glasgow grows by a factor of 10 times. From 1801 to 1901, the population went from 77,000 in Glasgow to 760,000 at the start of the 20th century. As thousands poured into Scottish cities in the Lowlands, many would have come across posters like the one that Dave saw. Here is the poster that Dave might have seen. Take a closer look at this poster. Think about what sort of message it is trying to send to Scottish people. Who do you think made it, and what sort of person were they trying to attract, and why? If you're watching this video for study, you can pause the video here and spend a couple of minutes jotting down your thoughts. Okay? To answer these questions properly, we need to look at 4 key issues. The first of these issues is that of land. The first thing this poster depicts is a wide expanse of land. Now, reflect for a second about how such an image would have appeared to an ex-Highlander like Dave. Remember that in the previous video we looked at how in the 19th century it was increasingly difficult for the average Scot to gain possession of land. The process of consolidation meant that fewer and fewer people were able to maintain their own small land holdings, leaving individuals in both the Highlands and the Lowlands forced to move to cities, where they would likely have to rent, often in bad conditions. The poster's promise then of owning your own farm might have seemed too good to be true. So how true was this promise? Could it really be possible? Was somewhere like Canada truly a place where anyone could go and secure a new future for themselves? While this poster certainly depicts an idealised image of life in North America, it nonetheless reflects a reality about land ownership on the other side of the Atlantic. As this story gets a little bit complicated at times, a little animated video for you to look at. Throughout this period, there were 3 primary destinations that Scots travelled to: the United States, Canada, and Australia. There were 2 things that all of these places had in common. First, they all had massive amounts of land. And second, relative to the amount of land available, they lacked people. North America, the most common destination for Scottish emigrants, was particularly suffering from this imbalance of a chronic shortage of people that prevented the country from developing. To understand why this is, it is worth pausing here to give a very brief background on the history of North America. The Americas, to Europeans anyway, represented a relatively recent discovery. They had been discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Now, putting to one side for a moment the impossibility of discovering a continent that other human beings, Native Americans in this case, had been living in for thousands of years, to the European mind, America represented a new world, an entire continent ready to be explored and exploited. Over the next 300 years, Europeans began to move in increasing numbers to colonize the Americas, claiming the land for themselves. In 1776, the United States, which had been part of the British Empire, defeated the British rulers and claimed their independence, giving people from all over the world the opportunity to come and settle there. Now, if all of that went over your head, please don't worry. The point you need to understand is that the United States and Canada were relatively new countries, and to reach their full potential, they needed large numbers of people to come and live there, to work the land, and to exploit the natural resources there. And there really was a lot of land. The state of Texas alone, one of 50 states in the United States of America, is roughly 2.8 times bigger than the whole of the United Kingdom. Compared to Scotland, which was suffering from a shortage of land, North America had the opposite problem. Not enough people who wanted to buy land. The consequences of this were quite simple. As the poster suggested, land in North America was very cheap. Unsurprisingly, millions of Europeans were drawn to land-rich America. In 1830, the population of the United States was 12.8 million. 100 years later, in 1930, it was 123 million. So like Glasgow, in the space of 100 years, the population of the United States increases by a factor of 10. When you think about the conditions the average Highlander had to face just in order to survive, with little to no real prospect of being able to access land for themselves, the prospect of an area many times the size of the United Kingdom that was largely uninhabited, would appear almost too good to believe. So this was a unique opportunity to create a life that would have been unimaginable back in Scotland. And this leads us to our second factor. So now we are talking about the economic factors. The first key dynamic pulling Scots towards the new world of the Americas was the abundance of land coupled with the lack of people, which made land cheaper and more readily available for purchase. There was, however, a secondary consequence of this that was just as attractive for potential Scottish emigrants, namely money. If you take one thing away from this video, it should be this: wages were much higher in North America than they were in Scotland. Now the textbook will tell you this, and especially for National 4, National 5 exams, that is what you need to know. But for those who want a little bit of a deeper understanding of why wages were higher, again, I've made a short video. So why were wages higher in North America compared to Scotland in the 19th and early 20th centuries? The reason that wages were higher in North America comes down to something called supply and demand. Some of you might have heard of this phrase. If you have, pause the video and write down what you think the term means. The law of supply and demand is perhaps the most famous rule in economics. It states that the price of something is determined by how much people want something, demand, and how much of that thing there is, supply. Okay, let's break this sentence down. How much people want something, economists call the demand, while how much of that thing there is, we call the supply. Let's give an example. The price of a scarce resource like a diamond would be dictated by how many people want diamonds versus how many diamonds there are. So, if millions of people are desperate for a new diamond wedding ring and there are only a tiny number of diamonds, we would expect the price of diamonds to go up. When it comes to wages, how much people get paid to do a job, a similar pattern emerges. Wages will be higher when there is a great demand for workers, but the supply of workers available is low. And wages will be low if the supply of workers is high and the demand for work is low. Lots of workers available but little work available, wages low. Lots of work available and numbers of workers low, wages high. In North America, there was really high demand for workers, but a very low supply. In these circumstances, what do you think happened to the wages? Again, if you're here for study, pause the video and have a go at answering. Hopefully, you answered that wages will be higher. The greater the demand for workers and the lower the supply, the higher the wages will be. Once again, if none of that made sense, please don't worry. This is history, not economics, and you don't need to know that much detail. If you're confused, just keep in mind the fact that wages were higher in North America than they were in Scotland, and they were much higher. By the second half of the 19th century, the difference in wages between Western Europe and the New World were becoming ever greater. People who had particular skills, skilled trades, industrial skills, were especially valuable. This helps to explain why so many Scots that left at this time were actually from middle-class professions. It was not just the poor that were leaving, but increasingly, as the century wore on, upwardly mobile and ambitious professionals. Thomas Devine writes, "It was now easier than ever before to evaluate opportunities in New York, Toronto and Chicago in relation to Glasgow and Edinburgh. The income differentials were often so enormous and the skills shortage in the New World so acute that many thousands could not resist." As if Scots needed any more incentive to emigrate, gold was discovered in several parts of the world in the mid-19th century. In California in 1849, in Australia in 1851, South Africa in 55, and New Zealand in 1861. And this leads us to factor 3, information. All this is well and good, but how were Scottish people supposed to know about developments happening thousands of miles away? What good was a gold mine opening on the other side of the world for the average Scot stuck in a factory in Glasgow? Well, they had to hear about it. Remember the poster that our fictional Dave noticed in the 1880s? Who produced that and why? The poster was produced by Canadian Pacific, Canada's largest Atlantic shipping company that began in the late 19th century. It owned the ships that would be used to transport Scots from Scotland and take them to North America. By putting out posters that showed an idealised image of what North America was like, it stood to profit from passengers paying for the voyage. This poster represented one part of an explosion of new information about the New World, produced not only by private companies like Canadian Pacific, but also governments, emigration societies and charitable organisations. The speed at which information travelled from one place to another enabled an entire industry to develop based solely on attracting potential Europeans to come and live in the New World. By the late 19th century, a growing number of posters, pamphlets and individuals were announcing this possibility. Motivations for these campaigns were varied. Sometimes governments stood to profit from attracting skilled workers. On the other side of the Atlantic, in Scotland, the government did on occasion offer financial support to help poorer emigrants leave. In 1922, the British government passed the Empire Settlement Act, which provided $3 million a year to help people emigrate. But in 1937, this amount was halved. The key thing to remember here is that governments in Britain didn't give much support to people that wanted to leave. And this is unsurprising. They often had as much to lose as to gain from the loss of people. Skilled workers leaving Britain obviously doesn't help Britain itself. Think just how scary it would have been to take the passage across the Atlantic. Even with the improvements in technology, people who left to go to these new lands, you might never hear of again. Who knows what lay for them on the other side of the Atlantic? But as more and more people departed, so too did more information spread, particularly in the cities. And there was something of a snowball effect here. As more and more Scots began to leave and set up life in the New World, more and more information came back to Scotland, reporting on the successes and occasional failures of life abroad. Overall, there were more success stories than there were failures, and the fact that Scots knew that there were already communities of Scottish people that they could move into would have greatly helped their motivation. The success of such campaigns is hinted at in the names of some of the New World colonies. Nova Scotia, for example, in Scotland literally translates as New Scotland. And in Nova Scotia, in the first half of the 19th century, 59% of UK settlers were Scottish. Finally, we have factor number 4, technological change. The final factor to discuss here is once again another unintended consequence of the Industrial Revolution, namely technological advance and the development of two key technologies, the steamship and the railway. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, only a small number of Europeans would have been able to afford the highly expensive and risk-laden voyage that would have taken them from Europe across the Atlantic to North America. For centuries, the journey across the Atlantic was fraught with so many dangers and was so expensive that relatively few numbers of people were able or willing to take the risk and leave their country. By the 19th century, however, improvements in technology changed this situation. One of the major effects of the Industrial Revolution was the speed of travel. The invention of the steamship radically increased the speed, comfort and safety of the Atlantic crossing. In the 1850s it took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic, but by 1914 this had fallen to just 1 week. Not only this, the development of railways meant that transportation within countries had also been revolutionised. The creation of railway lines both in Scotland and in North America only accelerated the speed at which people could travel. Now it was possible for the North American demand for workers to be met by a growing number of ambitious Scots. If the promise of land was not enough to pull Scottish workers to join, then they can instead be attracted by the promise of higher wages. So, having discussed the 4 factors that pulled Scots to leave Scotland and join a new country, we can provide a brief recap. At the start of the video, we introduced Dave and looked at the factors that were pulling Dave away from Scotland. We then looked at the poster that he encountered and asked about what sort of message other countries were sending to people in Scotland, particularly in North America. We then discussed the 4 key factors that pulled Scots away from Scotland. We looked at the ready availability of cheap land, We then discussed the issue of money and how wages, because of a lack of people in North America, were considerably higher in North America than back in Scotland. We then looked at information and how the spread of information about these new countries was spreading particularly in Scottish cities, where companies, governments and charitable societies could offer some assistance to people who were maybe struggling to afford to emigrate. Finally, we looked at the impact of technology, in particular the steamship, which made the speed and price of travelling across the Atlantic much more affordable. So hopefully you found that video useful. Again, if there was anything you liked or didn't like, please comment below. This is the second video I've made and I'm looking to improve. Hopefully the animations were quite useful. Please suggest if there are any other topics you would like to look at, or you think there is not much information about those topics online. Again, comment below. And finally, as I said in the last video, I am accepting students. If you think you could benefit from a bit of tutoring, then I am available as a history tutor. So once again, thanks for watching and see you soon.